BIBF. I hope that you can hear my voice. So if anyone can just let me know if you can hear me clearly, and so we can just start with the introduction, then proceed with our webinar content. So can you hear my voice, guys?
Yes, clear.
Yes, loud and clear.
Just thinking that you
Thank you very much, Muhammad, Marwa, Safa, and Dunya. And welcome again to fraud risk assessment. We'll have this topic, very important topic, for only 1 hour. There is a lot to mention there, but I'll try my best to cover as much possible as required to understand the whole process that is needed for the risk assessment or fraud risk assessment. At the beginning, I would like to introduce myself to you. My name is Mahmoud Abdullah Kadam. I'm a certified public accountant, CPA, and a certified fraud examiner, CFE. And my main experience as an external auditor and a banker, I used to work with Deloitte and Touche Bahrain and KPMG Fakhro Bahrain and Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. And currently, I'm a senior lecturer here in BIBF. And I believe that's it about me. Just a little bit about this topic. This topic is one of the topics that is discussed part of the ACP certification or Certified Fraud Examiner Professional Certificate. And there are actually many important and many beneficial, informative parts, but just as introduction and just to introduce CFE importance, I have chosen this topic to deliver some good information, hopefully to you, and promote our CFE certificate here in BIBF.
we lost your voice.
You went on mute.
ما نسمعك استاذ.
Mahmoud.
We can't hear you, sir.
You're not audible, Mr. Mahmood.
Hello. عنده تليفون يطق له تليفون.
Hello, Marhaba. You are not audible. Can you please unmute?
Yeah, someone call him, please, if you have his number.
Anybody here from BIBF?
Yes, we're going to his classroom to tell him to unmute himself.
You.
Okay, تمام. No, it's okay. I think it's okay. I think it's muted from.
Just ask them if they can hear you now.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes,
Alhamdulillah,
we can hear you.
loud and clear.
بس
Can you
استاذ
start
خلي
that?
بالك على الكومنت قاعدين من نص ساعه احنا نقول لك ما نسمعك.
Yes.
We'll
Yeah,
come
can you
back.
repeat it, sir, please?
All right, sir, guys. I'm sorry, I'm not sure where the part that you did not hear me. So if anyone can help me, can you just let me know what is the last thing you heard from me?
We heard your name and then you went to mute.
Just type it, if you don't mind, or if you remember.
We heard only your
Oh, my
introduction,
introduction.
sir.
All right. Okay, so, okay, name. All right. Excellent. All right. So, all right. Thank you very much. So, just to go from the start, again, I'm presenting this topic, which is part of ACFI certification or professional certificate. And this topic, one of the many topics, important topics that is discussed over the material of ACFI. And I choose this topic because of its importance to organization. Starting from the beginning again, is simply I talked about the risk in general, and I stated that risk involved in all organizations, simply even in our individual life, like when we do any particular process, when we drive, when we go and buy something from a mall, or when we go for a restaurant, we travel even. So any process we do, risk will be involved. And those risks can be a financial risk, can be a fraud risk, can be a business risk. So there are different type of risk that will be involved and exposed to organization. And one of these important risks is the fraud risk. And I stated earlier that just to show the importance of those risks, of this risk, I'm sorry, which is a fraud risk, as I mentioned some examples that have happened in Bahrain. For example, I'm not sure if you heard about it or not, but there were a 2.5 million Bahraini dinar embezzlement, a cash embezzlement from one of the big organizations through a collaboration of branch supervisors. Another case where their ghost employee, which is payroll fraud, that have been again incurred for one of the organization in Bahrain. There were also a small amount of money, but it's for also a large organization, 45,000 Bahraini dinar, that have been embezzled by one of its secretary in that organization or entity. And for privacy of and protection of reputation, I cannot mention names, and I'm just using these examples just to show how important is the fraud risk awareness and how frequent can happen, or how we are as organizations are exposed, and even as individuals are exposed to this type of fraud risk. I also stated earlier that in order to, or for a risk to happen, we will need a three element to exist there. The first one, and this is what we call the fraud triangle. So I need the three elements or factors of this triangles in order for a fraud to occur. And the first one would be an opportunity. And simply an opportunity we mean by there is I would say a chance for me to do a fraud. For example, availability of authorization stamp, Or it can be, for example, weak internal control. There is no security guard on the, for example, access of my organization. So theft will be easily enter the organization or the company premises. I'm not sure if I can find some more opportunities, but maybe weak internal control or weak financial recording transaction, which will again will open a way for the fraudsters to steal, to cheat, to change a transaction. And this is simply what we mean by an opportunity. The second factor or element of risk would be the pressure that we have. And pressure can be of different way. That can be a pressure of reaching a target, for example, a sales target, or it can be a pressure of having a luxury life for me as an employee, or it can be pressure of keeping my job as, for example, I'm not aware of what do I require to do at work. So these three elements or factors will need to be together in order for a fraud to exist. So simply for prevention or eliminating or mitigating fraud risk, simply I would just need to eliminate these factors or eliminate the opportunity, eliminate the pressure. I'm sorry, I didn't talk about rationalization. And the third one is eliminating my rationalization. And rationalization is simply what we mean by is justification. I will create a justification for my act. So for example, I would say, okay, I'm working a long hours, all right? So I'm entitled to take some stationery, for example, to home, right? Or for example, I've been a long time in an organization and never been promoted, and I never got bonus, and I never get appreciation. So it's okay if, for example, I take some money for myself. So rationalization is justification of the action that would be taken. And طبعا, as I stated earlier, that in order to eliminate fraud, simply I just need to get rid of these factors that will make my fraud a triangle. In general or in total, we will have what we call the inherent risk. And inherent risk, we mean by it the total risk exists for any organization. So simply whenever I do any type of process or operation or business, there will be a total risk there. And what we call, and this is what we call it, or they call it sometimes a gross risk. And after I implement control, which we mean by control, the processes that a process or activity, like I will apply on my operation. And for example, in BIBF, I'm going to have a control of registration or for attendance. So attendance is a control will be placed to avoid issuing certificate for someone who have not attended the IBF course, for example. So I'll have a total or gross risk. After I implement the control, there will be some remaining risk that I did not eliminate or mitigate or transfer. These are called the residual risk. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about how we are going to respond to these type of risk, or what we call the residual risk. All right. What are the factors that will influence the fraud risk assessment in organization? The first thing we'll talk about here is the nature of business. What is your business? Are you in the banking industry? Are you in insurance? Are you in manufacturing or trading? Every organization, depending on its nature of business, will have its own different fraud risk. So what will work for trading might not work for, or what is exposed for trading industry will not be exposed, for example, for insurance. Another factor would be my operating environment. So what type of environment? Am I in a digital business? All right, like for example, I would say getting all my services online, or the traditional way of buying and selling and receiving product. Again, the type of your environment also would affect the different type of fraud risk that you would be exposed to. The third factor I'm going to talk about here is my internal control. And is there an internal control or not? And if there is an internal control, is it effective? Is it working? So maybe I'll have a security guard, but actually security guard, I don't know if it's a good example, maybe he's sleeping all the time or he's sleeping at night. So this is an ineffective control I have for my organization. All right. So again, I will need to see whether my internal control are effective or not. And the last factor I'm going to talk about here under fraud risk that would expose organization to fraud risk is the ethical and values in organization. And simply here, we mean by it the integrity, behavior, how ethical is an organization and management in their business and in their dealing with customer and employee. This also would have an effect of a fraud risk. That is the fraud risk level that would be the organization would be exposed to. What is fraud risk assessment? So now we reach to the main, I would say, title of our presentation. What is fraud risk assessment? Fraud risk assessment is a process, or I would say continuous process of identifying and addressing risk of an organization. So simply I will see what are the risks for my organization, whether internally or externally from both sides. And based on that, I'm going to identify identify controls, and I'm going to identify level of exposure for my organization from those fraud risks, to take action later on. What is the objective of fraud risk assessment? All right, simply the main objective of this assessment is to build for me a framework or a list of fraud risk that identifying fraud risk that I am exposed to, and from which department, and sometimes even from which personnel, in order to take and respond to these risks to achieve my overall organizational objective. Now, why organization need to conduct a fraud risk assessment? Simply, which looks very logical, definitely I need to protect my premises and my asset in general. I need to protect my reputation. It is a good mean for communication between departments. Things need to be aware of. Developing a fraud risk assessment will help me to develop a framework of mitigation control, or in general internal control for organization. It will help me also to assess at the beginning my own internal control, whether they are effective, not effective, they are enough or not enough. And also it can be of a compliance required with regulators like Central Bank of Bahrain. Consideration when assessing internal control during fraud risk assessment. Now, when I develop a fraud risk assessment, I will need to look over some of the consideration that would be created or affected by the internal control. And the first thing is that internal control is not a continuous process that will stay with me till whatever life of my business. In another word, that an internal control might be eliminated, maybe due to the change of business. For example, from BIBF from physical classes to virtual classes. So the way of business have shifted or changed or restructured. As a result, the previous controls, for example, won't really work for current virtual classes. A simple example would be, for example, the final assessment. Previously, in physical classes, the final assessment are given individually to each trainee, and the lecturer will be watching those trainings. But now virtual is totally different because unless the camera is on, or even if it's on, still you won't really be able to monitor and ensure that the trainee are not using another material or looking at another material or cheating from another resources. Also in control here, when we develop a fraud risk assessment, things concerned to control will be like sometime, although there is control and these control are really very strong, however, that these control will not work if there is what we call collusion by employees or management. And we mean by collusion of management of employees simply is that two employees or two managers are going to agree on stealing or changing or falsifying information, whether it's financial or non-financial. This is what we call override of control. Moving on, element of a good fraud risk assessment. What are the elements that will make fraud risk assessment as, I would say, reasonable and a good assessment for my organization? The first one I'm going to talk about is the collaborative effort of management and employees and auditors in organization. Also, it's very important we have the right sponsor for this risk assessment. What I mean by here is that the manager of this assessment, it should be a person who's independent and trusted and can have an effect in an organization in order to lead this type of project or assessment. I have already talked about independence and objectivity again, because as we say independent, if I'm not independent, then definitely this assessment won't be really run as required or as we are what we are looking for. At the same thing, I need to be objective in my opinion and to lead the people or the team and conduct the proper work required for this assessment. The third one, or the fourth one, I'm sorry here, I'm talking about the knowledge of businesses. I cannot really assess things that I'm not aware of. So it's really very important that I know how BIBF is working. I know how, for example, Google is working, or how, for example, X bank or X company is working. Without having a good knowledge, I won't really be able to assess the overall organization. Another thing is the access to people or employees in an organization. So I will need to have the ability and permission to go over different department and visit different personnel or interview different personnel or employees in organization. Another element would be the engendered trust. Like without the trust of management and employees with the sponsor or the manager of the organization, again, there will be no cooperation from management or from employees for this assessment. So a trust would be also of importance. Before the last is I need to have ability to think the unthinkable, or in another word, to think in the from or the same mind as the fraudsters. Like how do the thief or fraudster would think about changing, stealing, or other things. I need to think about different ways, and I need to think about in the same way those people are thinking. So I would be able to look over and see risk that will my company or my organization are exposed to. And the last thing, we need to have this assessment or this plan as alive and relevant. In another word, I will need to have this continuously monitored and continuously assessed and monitored by organization. Now, another consideration for developing an effective fraud risk is need to be used with the same language of business. Also, I will need to have in mind that what would be applied for BIBF as a risk or fraud risk assessment won't be applied to, for example, other organization or banking industry, and will not be applied, for example, for trading or manufacturing organization. And my assessment should fit my business and should fit my type of business and environment of my organization. And the last thing I would need to mention here is the more complicated the fraud risk assessment, the harder it would be to execute it and use it to drive this assessment. So we'll always need to keep things simple to be more beneficial and easy to monitor and to apply and to assess. In the preparation of the fraud risk assessment, we will have goals, and the first thing I will need to start with is simply I will need to assemble my team. Like who would be with me in this risk assessment, followed by identifying information to be gathered and the best techniques to gather these type of information. So what type of information I'm looking on, financial, non-financial, and how I'm going to gather these type of information. Will I have interview or surveys, or for example, focus group or some other type of source or method that I'm going to collect those information. And the third one is that I will be deciding on what is the scope of work that will be performed. And the method, as I stated earlier, that I'm going to use, whether it's interview or some other type of method that I'm going to collect information, and who will be participated in those methods. And for example, which employees I'll be targeting, or which personnel I'm going to target. All right, this is also important. And what are the content of those methods? For example, if I'm going to use a survey, what would be the question that I'm going to list down? And finally here in this step, I would look at what are the form of output I have. Will I be issuing a report, a presentation, or just an oral delivery of my finding. And last, I will need to educate my employees with regards to the importance of fraud risk assessment and how their cooperation would be expected and required in order to for this assessment to succeed. Now, moving off the practical side of our assessment and the steps that is required, or how we are going to prepare or develop a risk assessment or a fraud risk assessment. The first thing is I will need to identify I need to identify the potential inherent and inherent fraud risk and schemes. And in this simply I will need to have an overall understanding of my organization and what are the incentives for employees and even for business. What are even the pressures that employees have? What are the opportunities available for employees? And whether there is possibility of override of control. And as I stated earlier, what I mean by override is the coordination or collaboration between two employee or two management level in order to override or go over or pass the or eliminate that control. Here also, in looking over the potential fraud risk or total risk in organization, I will need to identify the risks that are of financial or asset misappropriation or corruption risk that I have. Or maybe I have regulatory risk or reputation risk, or even IT or information technology risk I have in my organization. Moving over, the next step under the fraud risk assessment would be assess the likelihood of occurrence of identified fraud risk. And here, simply, I will measure my risk in terms of, are these remote to occur, or they are possibly occur, or reasonably possible to occur, or probable to occur. Simply, I'm going to give them a grade, and sometimes these level or grading them would be of a number, for example, 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, depend on the organization methodology or the organization policies or method that they are going to use. In the third step, I'm going to assess the risk significance to organization. Assess the fraud risk significance to the organization. Earlier, the second step, we were talking about the likelihood, how probable that particular action or the fraud risk to incur or to happen. Where here in the second level, or third step, third step is how significant is this risk to the organization in terms of amount, or even in terms of, I would say, qualitative volume to organization, or qualitative factor to organization. And here I will need to state whether these risks are of material, and when I say material, I mean the volume of amount to organization. Organization is really high, is significant outside. I don't want to use actually significant here. So I say it's really high and large to organization. Or if it is immaterial. So either I'll have material of a large amount of money, or a large amount number or volume, or on the other side, immaterial, which is a small amount. When we say immaterial, we mean by it that it won't really affect the organization financially. However, sometimes I will need to look over these material or immaterial in a way that of significance. That's why actually earlier I didn't want to use significance in explaining the materiality here. And what I wanted to say, maybe losing 100 dinar for BIBF would be immaterial, as 100 dinar will not affect the overall the financial position of BIBF or even its performance in total. However, if this 100 is lost due to fraud, then this would be of significance to organization. So under the fraud risk assessment, I'll keep a column for me that will highlight whether is it material or immaterial. Then I would say, is this significance or insignificant? For me, again, for a proper response at the next level or at the end at the assessment.
We can't hear you again.
Muted again. You've been muted again.
I'm sorry, guys. I don't know why you are losing, why it's muted, but hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, loud and clear.
The fourth step, please.
All right, thank you, Fatima. All right, so our fourth step was evaluating which people and department are most likely to commit. So I need to look over what are the most sensitive departments for me and people. For example, maybe I would look over the treasury or the vault in a bank or the cash collection or the teller in a bank, for example, or the sales team who are collecting the cash on behalf of my organization. So I will need to identify also those personnel and department in order to have a better assessment and response later on. After identify the total risk I have, the likelihood, the significance, departments and people that would most probably, again, someone saying that he cannot hear me. Can you hear me, guys?
For me, yeah, I can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I will need to list down all internal controls that is there in my organization to address or to mitigate or to stop or to prevent those risks. So after I identify all those risks, see their likelihood, significance, and people and department, I will need to see, is there any control over those risks in my organization? And I need to identify, are those a preventative control or a detective control? A preventative control simply is a control that will stop the risk from happening, where detective is that after the risk has happened, I will be able to see what happened, how does it happen, documentation for it. And as a simple example for preventive control would be, for example, separation of duties. In another word, that Mahmoud, who is delivering the classes in BIBF, will not, he's not the one who's registering the trainees or the students into the class. To avoid that, we don't talk about this, but to avoid, for example, Mahmoud issuing certificate for people who's not attending the class. So there will be a separation of duties. There will be a people or department that is independent of registration, and there will be a lecturer who's just independent of presentation and delivering of material. Where a simple detective control would be, for example, the CCTV camera, all right, which simply after the incident happened, after a fraud is there, I will look over the CCTV camera and see what has happened, when does it happen, and who have done such risk. When we identify all controls there, whether they are preventive or detective, we are going to evaluate or measure their effectiveness and efficiency, or are they efficient, or are they enough to again mitigate or prevent the risk. And finally, the last step would be simply identify, evaluate, and respond to the residual fraud risk resulting from ineffective or non-existing control. So simply as I showed you earlier, so let me just go back, that we have a total fraud risk, and this total fraud risk will be reduced or eliminated or transferred after we apply something called controls. After we apply control, we'll have something called residual risk. Those risks is the remaining risk. Those risks may be because my control is not enough, or might be I don't have a control, or control is not there, or I did not place even a control over it. All right, for many reasons, is simply sometimes organization it will not be practical for organization to, for example, to place a control, because placing that control is more expensive or more costly than really accepting a control. For example, let's say that I have a fraud risk, I'm assuming, of 100 dinar. And in order to prevent this risk, I'm going to, for example, to hire an employee who I'm going to pay him 500 dinar a month, which over a year it will cost me more than 5,000 dinar or 6,000 dinar, which is not logical for me. Another thing I would, so sometimes we need to accept risk. Sometimes it's not practical even to accept risk. As a result, I will always have residual risk. That's why organization will need to decide on what we call tolerance risk or risk acceptance. What are the level of risk that BIBF is going to, for example, to accept? Is it 1,000 dinar? Is it 2,000? Is it 100,000? And whatever in terms of monetary item. I believe I'm done here, and there's only 15 minutes, so I'd like to keep it for any questions you have. So if you have any question, please go ahead. I don't know whether you can open your mic or not, but if you can open your mic, just please go ahead and speak. And if not, then I'll need to look over the chat here. Not always. That's okay. So guys, if you have a question, please, you may type it down. So just to avoid that, I go over all the chat. طبعا, as I stated earlier, while I'm waiting for your question, is that this is a really very small part, which I didn't cover in full in terms of topic of fraud risk, part of ACFI professional certificate, which is really very beneficial and very helpful for individuals to develop in their career, and definitely will be of an adding value to your organization and to your employer. just to share a little bit of my experience with obtaining the certified fraud examiner certificate. I will get to you, Maya. Okay, I just lost what I want to say, so I'm going back to the question. So after filtering the risk, so shall we reevaluate the residual? Yes, and this is what we just stated. Like, I will need to see what is the residual risk I have. For example, let's assume it's in terms of value, it's 100 dinar. Then I need to compare it with my organization. Am I, as organization, can take 100,000 loss? Yani if a loss of 100,000 happen, if this fraud happen, is it okay for the organization or not? In terms of okay, I mean, is this material significant amount? And again, we have already highlighted these terminologies earlier, is that saying material and saying significant. Sometimes the materials, sometimes the residual risk is immaterial, but it would be significant. So again, are we accepting such things? Are we, for example, in terms of reputation, is it okay if we have some bad news in the market? طبعا depend on your company and who you are. All right. How fraud risk is different from a normal risk exercise, except for adding the word fraud to it. Okay. A fraud risk can be of different type, and as you can see, fraud risk are in terms of nature, they are really changing and very fast. And as an evidence, you can see those days how fraud are done, how it is. For example, I would know that there is risk rate risk, for example, or default risk. All right, and this would be always there. Right? Whenever I, for example, provide a financing or loan as a bank to my customers, or some other even credit facility as a company to my customers. However, a fraud, that's why we said the fraud risk assessment is a continuous process that will need to be done and measured and evaluate on periodical basis. And look, it's more sensitive than unchanging in terms of nature and term of way things is done. That's why we'll need to, again, that's why, and this is how it's really differ from other type of risk. One more step I'd like to add over here, maybe you can see normally in the normal risk, we might highlight, for example, departments, but we will not highlight, for example, employees who will be exposed to. We will highlight it to, for example, for an operation or a process or a department. But you can see here, we'll need to look over even the people and the people and departments in organization. How to process, evaluate, and identify the risk. In another word, how to expect new. All right, excellent. This is where I just said that the continuous process. And for example, and simply, or let me just go back, and I would say the question is how to identify a risk, or how can Mahmoud identify a risk in an organization? Simply, I will need definitely first understanding of or knowledge of the process. Let's assume particular process. And after that, going over this and revising my process, I will need always to have in mind of ways to risk to happen. And as a result, I'll be able to, or things or losses that will be happening. As a result, I'm going to identify those risks. The same would be continuous assessment or fraud risk assessment for organization will identify a new risk that you have not identified earlier. And as an alert or notification for you, as I stated earlier, maybe a change in business, a change in environment, IT change, and so on. In your opinion, the fraud risk department should be independent. Definitely, they should be independent. If they are not independent, then they might not be able. You know, simply, can you imagine that I'm doing a fraud? I'm doing fraud assessment, and for example, I'm the same person who is, for example, controlling the payroll, and I'm doing some fraud there. So simply, I'm not going to list down or even highlight the area I'm working in. No, my fraud applies as management is also. I don't know whether you are answering here. Management is responsible to identify the risk. IA shall evaluate if the identification exercise was in line with best practice, and they will keep it. I open notice. I think he's answering something. I'm not sure what he's trying to say. Maya, is fraud risk applies as internal audit practice? Yes, definitely. It's a part. It's an internal audit, internal practice for organization. But is it done by the auditor? No, normally it should be done by management, not by auditor. So that's why I didn't say, I wouldn't say that internal audit practice. The internal auditor will benefit from this assessment in order to verify and assess the internal control and other things that organization are hiring or are looking from the audit department. Thank you for that. Thank you, Arvineet, and thanks for attending also, guys. Any other question? Please go ahead, and thanks for participation, guys. Thanks, Yasser, and thanks for everybody here, guys. As I stated earlier, I mean, being a CFA is really of an adding value and of informative, despite the level of experience that you may have. You will be introduced and look over different areas and information that will add a lot of value to you. And if anyone are interested to join our classes and courses here in BIBF, Munira, my colleague here, will be of assistant to you. She just post, I believe, a link there. And are we going to receive the presentation slide? Hisham, it depends. If you pay, we will send it over to you. If you don't pay, you'll not get the PowerPoint. All right. What is the classification of, what's that? What is it? CPD. I'm not sure about all of these guys that CPD certificate or attendance or other things, but please contact my colleague Munira. I think you can see her name there. I think she also posted a link over the chat. So please just contact her, and she should help you with that. Okay, if she's already answering you. Any other question, guys? Thanks, Talib, and thanks to all of you guys. Sorry, the chat is just moving a little bit fast. I can't really trace all the comments. Thank you, Maya. Thanks also for being here in the class, and looking forward to see you all guys here in BIBF. Thanks, Muhammad.
ما قصرت ويعطيك العافية سلمى.
Thank you, Savita. No, not really, Aziz. I mean, all risks are considered because there are really a lot of risks and very important risk for organization, as I stated earlier. Definitely it would be of a concern or focus of management. But fraud would be of more sensitive, I would say. Thank you all, guys, and hope to meet you here in BIBF. And thank you very much again. And if there is anything, as I stated, you may contact my colleague Munira, or I'll leave my email for you here. It's mahmoud@bibf.com. Sorry. Yes, right, okay. Thank you, Talal, and we'll see you, inshallah. All right, guys, I'm going to leave. If you don't have any question, I have left my I have left my email, and you may contact me if you require any further assistance or information. Thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you. Hopefully to see you, inshallah, in the future. All right. I believe, Munira, I can close the team now, or